a few weeks back when vandals run amok inside the Drayton Toowoomba cemetery and caused hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages. Toowoomba residents were quite rightly and probably not unexpectedly appalled and outraged. It did shine a spotlight on how revered that place and that chapter of our city's history is. And I went out to the Drayton Toowoomba Cemetery to have a little bit of a wander and a chat with Lisa Herbert to find out what she found out. Lisa, on this fairly windy spring day at the Drayton Toowoomba Cemetery, where are we now?
Under blue skies and a little bit of wind,
yes.
The pioneering Church of England section of the cemetery. The first burial here in the cemetery was 1850. So we're talking a lot of history that we're looking at. And for all these amazing monuments that are well over 100 years old that we're looking in front of us now, there's a whole lot of graves that we can't see, because in this cemetery there's close to probably 2,300 people buried here, and their names are on the burial register, but the graves are unknown.
What circumstances would lead to that?
Australia has a very bad record-keeping system. We've got a bad record of protecting our history. Yeah. So, simply just lost records. But then there are also a lot of graves here of people that we just don't know the names of. They don't appear on burial records, but the graves are obvious, like sunken holes or changes in the grass type and soil type. Yeah. And the sad thing about the cemeteries is sometimes the only sign that a human being existed could be a headstone or it could be a newspaper article. And there's a couple of newspaper articles that I've found of people buried here, because it talks about the funeral at this cemetery, but when you go to the records, there are no records of them. Because when the cemetery opened, for about 15 or 20 years, nobody had to keep records. The government didn't expect death records.
So we've left the Anglican section, or Church of England.
Church of England, heading to the Lutheran section, where we'll find a lot of Germans. There are lots of Germans here because Germans were incredibly important in the development of the Darling Downs region. But we've just reached an incredible angel who must stand 2 metres high. She's got Auf Wiedersehen written at her feet, and it's in loving memory of Harold Nathaniel Hase, who was a 15-year-old, and he died from rheumatic fever in 1911. So this angel is a symbol of spirituality. They're messengers of God. And darling Harold's father was so bereft, he made that choice to get this incredible carving. It's solid marble from Carrara, which is in Italy outside of Tuscany. So this angel was hand chiselled.
Incredible.
Yeah, and Carrara marble has been mined since the Roman times, so 2,000 years. And there's about overall maybe 600, 700 quarries at Carrara. Only half of them are in operation now. Some of them have run out of the good marble. But like Michelangelo, for example, used Carrara marble.
Extraordinary.
And we can see here that this magnificent angel has lost an arm. That would have been from vandalism over the years. It wasn't in the most recent thing.
No.
In fact, this angel, when I heard about the vandalism, she was the first one I thought of.
Absolutely.
And incredibly, the Calvary cross in front of her has been vandalised, and there are monuments behind her that were vandalised, but for some reason, and probably because she's just so big and hardy, she was untouched. But it just goes to show, like a 15-year-old dying, that the grief that the father suffered.
Do we know anything about how he died, and indeed what was the background of the father that he could afford to build this sort of tribute to his son?
Yeah, so Harold died of rheumatic fever. The family started in South Australia and were on the land, and they moved up to Roma and then came into Toowoomba to retire. So from the land.
This is a beautiful tribute, and whatever it cost him, for us to still be talking about it, 115 years afterwards, that's quite extraordinary.
And she's just been refurbished as well, and that's why I know so much about this particular grave, because I met the descendants standing at this particular grave. And again, it's a wonderful reason. If you see someone in a cemetery, chat to them. I found a newspaper article in 1865. Mr. Franz Ringe, who was struck by lightning one afternoon near a bridge on Herries Street. There wasn't a thunderstorm, there wasn't rain, but there was lightning. There was one looming. And there was an inquest into his death, and it found that the lightning hit the right side of his head, went through his body, then created a foot-long kind of divot in the ground. But back in those days, there would be an inquest into that death, and a jury would sit on the inquest. And the jury then found accidental death to be the cause of death. And then the coroner gives, just like a coroner these days, gives some tips or things to look at.
It's where you can learn from it.
Exactly right. And one of those things was how to protect yourself during a storm. And this is in the late 1800s, and he was saying that, okay, you stay away from trees, but also if you're riding a horse, you get off the horse, you take the saddle off, and you put the saddle over your head to protect you from lightning.
Right.
So just by evaluating somebody who died in this cemetery and is buried in this cemetery, you learn about the judicial system, like the inquest system, and you learn about putting a saddle over your head. And
am I right that this gentleman, his grave is actually unmarked?
Unmarked and unknown, so he's here somewhere. And unless I found his name in the paper, like, no one has probably said his name for, I don't know, 150 years.
Yeah.
And there's so many stories like that. So for every grave you do see in a cemetery, there are graves that you don't.
So, Lisa, we've come back into the Church of England section now. Tell me about this gravesite that we're standing in front of, Alfred Blincoe.
Yeah, so he was the father of Mary and Dinah Blincoe. She was a 7-year-old when she died of epilepsy in about 1887, and she was one of 12 children, and apparently the favourite, you know, the last daughter. So again, a bereft father carved this himself. So he was from the UK, and he came to Australia from England as an 18-year-old. He could read, but he couldn't write, which meant in that breaking industrial age, his only prospects were to work in a factory. So it would have been hard, long hours with little pay. So why wouldn't you try your luck?
In a new country.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
So Alfred came here under the Immigration Act at the time. It was called assisted immigration. So that meant he had to repay his passage by doing some sort of service. And yeah, so he was working. He worked as an agricultural labourer. And we can see by this incredible monument, which looks very, very similar to a sarcophagus, so an upright rectangle monument that you might see in the Roman era. And so typical of Toowoomba Cemetery is the use of sandstone. So there would have been this huge big block of sandstone would have been brought up from Helidon. We had very, very good quality sandstone from Helidon. There was also a quarry at Goodna. That's why there's so much sandstone in this particular cemetery. But yeah, so a big block of sandstone would have been dropped here, and he would have spent weeks and weeks and weeks carving this incredible thing. At the top is a hand holding a broken rose, symbolising the death of a breaking of a child, a broken child.
What got you so interested in this side of, I was going to say this side of life, it's probably not the right terminology, but the other side of life?
Well, it is. Well, it's an interesting concept, is what is life? And if you can understand death and you approach your mortality, candidly, and you understand you're here for a finite way and a finite time, perhaps you can live that little bit better, making the most of the time, because you appreciate that one day it's going to come to an end. And I was particularly drawn to cemeteries as part of my death literacy advocacy. So I have a funeral planning guide and workbook out called the Bottom Drawer Book. And from that, I wanted to help people at a horrible time in their lives, like that 2-week window after somebody dies. There's so much confusion. You're not thinking straight. So I thought if people had like a bit of a template of what their loved one wanted, the loved one said, I want to be buried in Toowoomba Cemetery. I want this monument, or I want to be cremated. It takes that pressure off not knowing. The reason I like doing that is they're sent off how they wanted to be sent off. So that also helps with the grieving process. So as distraught as you are, you can go, at least we did what she wanted. Right. And so it brings that little bit of a tiny bit of smile at a really hard time, and you were able to farewell them with their story and what they wanted. And it comes back to your story is important, no matter if you're a pioneer or whether you're working today in 2024 in Toowoomba. What you do contributes to this society, and that needs to be celebrated and documented in some form. And that doesn't mean put on a website or write a book. It just means perhaps write it down so at your farewell, the 50 people at your funeral gets to learn that. We need to acknowledge that our stories are important.
Yeah, Lisa Herbert, there was so much more that we talked about, some really interesting aspects of the cemetery, the Drayton Toowoomba Cemetery. But if you're interested in having a tour of the Drayton Toowoomba Cemetery, then worth getting in touch with Lisa Herbert. If you just Google Cemetery Tours Toowoomba,